Jae-min stood by the window of his office, looking down at the city lights he had helped build from nothing, believing that the hardest part of success was already behind him. At 29, he was the youngest CEO in the industry, the face of a rising tech empire, and a man who believed that loyalty, once earned, could never be broken. That belief came from one person alone: his best friend, Min-ho. They had grown up together, shared instant noodles during power outages, slept on the same classroom desks, and promised each other that if one ever made it, the other would never be left behind. When Jae-min founded the company, Min-ho was the first person he hired, not because he was the most qualified, but because trust mattered more than skill. And for years, Min-ho played his role perfectly. He smiled in meetings, supported every decision, and stood beside Jae-min during every interview, always half a step behind, always looking loyal. Even Seo Ji-yeon, the woman Jae-min loved and planned to marry, trusted Min-ho completely because Jae-min trusted him with his life. What Jae-min didn't notice was how Min-ho watched everything quietly, learning not just the business, but the weaknesses of the man who built it. The late nights, the exhaustion, the blind faith. On the surface, Jae-min had everything, but underneath, he was slowly handing over control without realizing it. The first betrayal didn't come with drama or confrontation. It came disguised as help. When Jae-min collapsed from overwork and was hospitalized, Min-ho stepped in to temporarily handle company affairs, reassuring everyone that it was only until Jae-min recovered. Contracts were signed, decisions were made, authority shifted quietly. By the time Jae-min returned, thinner and weaker but still confident, the company no longer felt the same, though everyone smiled as if nothing had changed. Min-ho insisted Jae-min rest more, pushed paperwork away from him, and reminded him that trust meant letting go sometimes. And Jae-min listened. At the same time, Seo Yan began pulling away, canceling dinners, replying late to messages, and avoiding conversations about the future they once planned together. Jae-min blamed stress, believing love only needed time, never suspecting that the man he called brother was slowly stepping into his place. The real betrayal arrived the night Jae-min decided to surprise Seo Yan, showing up at her apartment unannounced, holding a ring he had hidden for months. The lights were on. Laughter echoed inside, and when the door opened, the sight before him shattered everything he believed was unbreakable. Min-ho stood there, comfortable, relaxed, wearing the smile Jae-min had seen his entire life. Behind him, Sejyeon froze, her face pale, her silence louder than any confession. No explanations followed. No apologies came. Only the quiet understanding that something precious had already been taken long before this moment. Jae-min walked away without a word, because shock had stolen his voice, and pride refused to beg for answers he already knew. But betrayal was not finished with him yet. The next morning, Jae-min was called into an emergency board meeting, unaware that his name had already been erased from the future he built. As he entered the room, he noticed the way people avoided his eyes, the way Min-ho sat at the head of the table, calm and confident, as if he belonged there. That was when Jae-min realized something was deeply wrong. Before he could speak, the board chairman cleared his throat and announced a restructuring decision that would change everything. And in that moment, Jae-min understood too late that the friend he trusted more than himself had not only stolen his love, but was about to take his company and possibly his life as well. The real nightmare was just beginning. The boardroom felt colder than usual, even though the lights were bright and the air conditioner hummed quietly above their heads. Jae-min stood at the far end of the table, holding a thin folder he had not been allowed to open yet, while every familiar face around him suddenly felt distant. No one spoke in his defense. No one met his eyes. Min-ho sat at the head of the table, relaxed, composed, and dressed in a suit that looked almost identical to Jae-min's own, as if the roles had already been switched long ago. The chairman began speaking in a neutral tone, explaining that due to recent instability and concerns about leadership health, the board had voted to temporarily suspend Jae-min from executive control. The word temporarily sounded polite, but the signatures at the bottom of the document told a very different story. Jae-min finally understood that the contracts Minho had signed during his hospitalization were never meant to protect the company. They were meant to lock him out of it. When Jae-min tried to object, citing clauses only the founder could authorize, Minho calmly corrected him, pointing out amendments that Jae-min himself had unknowingly approved months ago. Every detail had been planned. Every loophole had been exploited. The board voted again, this time unanimously, and just like that, Jae-min was removed as CEO of the company he built with his own hands. Security escorted him out of the building, not roughly, but firmly, as if he were already a stranger. Standing in the lobby, Jae-min watched employees rush past him without slowing down. People who once bowed their heads and called him sir, now pretending they had never known him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and for a brief moment, he hoped it was Soo-yeon, finally calling to explain, to apologize, or at least to say goodbye properly. Instead, it was a notification from the bank. All his personal accounts had been frozen. Minho had moved faster than Jae-min ever imagined, separating company assets from personal ones, leaving him legally powerless and financially exposed. By nightfall, the apartment Jae-min lived in was no longer his either. Ownership transferred under clauses he never noticed, signed during moments when exhaustion clouded his judgment. He sat alone on a park bench, staring at the city skyline, realizing that in less than 24 hours, he had lost his job, his company, and the woman he planned to marry. But the cruelest blow had yet to land. The following morning, headlines flooded the internet, painting Jae-min as an unstable founder who mismanaged funds, abused authority, and nearly drove the company into collapse. Photos were released, stories were twisted, lies spread faster than truth ever could. Minho appeared in an interview that afternoon, speaking softly about betrayal, responsibility, and his painful decision to save the company from someone he once called a brother. Soo-yeon stood beside him, silent, her presence confirming everything Jae-min feared but refused to accept. Watching the broadcast from a cheap motel room, Jae-min felt something inside him break completely, not with anger, but with disbelief at how easily his life had been rewritten. Days passed, then weeks, and every door Jae-min knocked on closed before he could explain himself, because his name had already been destroyed. Former partners avoided him. Friends stopped answering calls. Eventually, even the world seemed to forget he had ever existed. One rainy night, exhausted and sick, Jae-min collapsed in an alley behind a convenience store, clutching his chest as the pain grew unbearable. As his vision faded, he wondered if this was the end, and whether trusting Minho had been the biggest mistake of his life. But fate had not finished with him yet. When Jae-min opened his eyes, he was staring at the ceiling of a small clinic, and beside his bed sat an elderly man watching him with sharp, knowing eyes. The man smiled faintly and spoke a single sentence that changed everything. "So you're the boy who lost everything because he trusted the wrong person?" Jae-min didn't know it yet, but this encounter would become the turning point that Minho never saw coming. Jae-min woke slowly, his body heavy and his thoughts even heavier, as the dull ache in his chest reminded him that he had nearly died without anyone noticing. The small clinic room smelled of disinfectant and old books, nothing like the sterile luxury hospitals he once owned shares in, and that contrast alone felt like punishment. The elderly man sat quietly beside the bed, his posture relaxed, his eyes sharp, as if he were studying Jae-min rather than worrying about him. Jae-min tried to speak, but his throat was dry, and before he could ask anything, the man calmly told him to rest, explaining that stress and exhaustion had finally caught up with him. Only after the nurse left did the man finally introduce himself as Chairman Kang, a retired investor who had stepped away from the public eye years ago. Jae-min didn't recognize the name at first, which surprised him, until Chairman Kang smiled and said that powerful people rarely stay visible once they learn how dangerous attention can be. As rain tapped against the window, the old man revealed that he had been watching Jae-min's company long before Min-ho ever touched it, curious about the young founder who rose too fast and trusted too deeply. He admitted that he had also watched Min-ho, noting how easily ambition disguised itself as loyalty when given enough time. Jae-min felt exposed, as if every mistake he had made was being laid bare. But instead of judgment, he heard something else in the old man's voice. Chairman Kang confessed that years ago, he had made the same mistake, trusting a partner who smiled while sharpening a knife, and losing everything before learning how betrayal truly worked. That was why, when he saw Jae-min collapse in the rain, he chose to intervene, not out of kindness alone, but because he recognized a familiar kind of ruin. Jae-min listened in silence, realizing that for the first time since losing everything, someone believed his story without asking for proof. Over the next few days, Chairman Kang paid for Jae-min's treatment and offered him a quiet place to recover. A modest house far from the city where no one recognized his face or cared about his past. There, stripped of titles and expectations, Jae-min began to breathe again, even as bitterness simmered beneath the surface. He wanted revenge, but he didn't know where to start, because Min-ho controlled the company, the narrative, and every path Jae-min once walked. Chairman Kang listened patiently and then asked a simple question that unsettled him. "If you took everything back tomorrow," the old man asked, "would you still be the same man who lost it?" The question lingered, forcing Jae-min to confront a truth he had been avoiding, that his downfall wasn't caused by betrayal alone, but by arrogance disguised as trust. Under Chairman Kang's guidance, Jae-min began rebuilding himself quietly, learning finance, law, and corporate warfare from the ground up, this time without shortcuts or blind faith. Months passed, and while the world believed Jae-min had disappeared, he was studying patterns, tracing money flows, and understanding exactly how Min-ho had dismantled him. Meanwhile, Min-ho enjoyed his rise, appearing in magazines, expanding the company aggressively, and standing beside Seo-yun as if they were always meant to be together. But power began changing Min-ho, exposing impatience, greed, and carelessness that Jae-min recognized immediately. Chairman Kang pointed out every flaw, reminding Jae-min that betrayal always carried the seed of its own destruction. The first opportunity came quietly, through a failed overseas investment Min-ho rushed into, desperate to prove himself bigger than the founder he replaced. Jae-min saw it instantly, a weakness. Chairman Kang smiled for the first time and asked if Jae-min was ready to step back into the game, not as the man he was, but as someone far more dangerous. Jae-min didn't answer right away. That night, he looked at his reflection, thinner, sharper, no longer naive, and understood that survival had already changed him. And for the first time since his fall, Jae-min felt something solid beneath the anger: control. Jae-min did not return to the world loudly, because loud moves were exactly what Min-ho expected from someone desperate. Instead, he re-entered the game quietly, through doors no one thought to watch, using names that meant nothing and influence that couldn't be traced back to him. Under Chairman Kang's guidance, Jae-min created a new identity, one without a past, without a reputation, and without any emotional ties that could be exploited. He became Director Jae, an anonymous investor operating through intermediaries, a ghost whose money spoke louder than his face ever could. The first move wasn't an attack, but a test. Jae-min targeted one of Min-ho's newest overseas expansions. A logistics acquisition rushed through without proper due diligence, driven more by ego than strategy. Using shell companies and proxy negotiations, Jae-min quietly bought up critical supply routes connected to the deal. positioning himself where a single decision could shift the balance overnight. Min-ho, blinded by early success and public praise, never noticed the pressure tightening around him. Inside the company, cracks were already forming. Executives who once feared Jae-min's calm authority now whispered behind Min-ho's back, uneasy with his impulsive decisions and growing need for validation. So Jeon noticed it too. Though she stood beside Min-ho in public, her smiles had become rehearsed, her silence heavier, as if something inside her resisted the life she had chosen. Jae-min watched all of it from a distance, not with longing, but with clarity, understanding now that love built on ambition always demanded a sacrifice. Chairman Kang reminded him daily that revenge wasn't about destruction, but about timing, and Jae-min learned to wait even when opportunities tempted him to strike early. The first visible consequence arrived when Min-ho's overseas project stalled unexpectedly, shipments delayed, costs rising, and investors growing impatient. Min-ho responded with anger instead of strategy, pushing his team harder, ignoring warnings, and blaming subordinates the way he once blamed Jae-min. From the shadows, Jae-min made a single adjustment. Contracts were withdrawn. Support vanished. Confidence cracked. Min-ho felt it immediately, sensing resistance but unable to identify its source, which only fueled his paranoia. At the same time, Jae-min reached out to people he once trusted, not asking for loyalty, but offering them a chance to leave a sinking ship without risking their futures. Some refused. Some hesitated. Some listened. Those who listened quietly stepped away from Min-ho's inner circle, weakening him piece by piece while believing they were acting on their own instincts. One evening, So-yeon confronted Min-ho privately, questioning the sudden instability and the growing rumors of internal conflict. Min-ho dismissed her concerns, but the frustration in his voice revealed fear he hadn't felt before. Jae-min heard about the argument through indirect channels and felt no satisfaction, only confirmation that the plan was working exactly as intended. Chairman Kang warned him that the closer Min-ho came to losing control, the more dangerous he would become, because desperate men often burned everything around them. Jae-min nodded, knowing that the real battle hadn't started yet. This was only the opening act. Late one night, Jae-min reviewed financial reports alone, spotting something that made him pause, a trail he hadn't noticed before. Hidden accounts tied not just to Min-ho, but to criminal partners beyond corporate betrayal. The truth was darker than he expected. Min-ho hadn't just stolen his company. He had turned it into a weapon. Jae-min leaned back, realizing that exposing Min-ho now would destroy the company along with him, hurting thousands of innocent employees who had nothing to do with their past. And in that moment, Jae-min faced the hardest choice yet. If he continued, there would be no clean victory, only consequences. As dawn broke, Jae-min made his decision, one that would push the story beyond revenge and into something far more dangerous. He would take Min-ho down slowly, publicly, and in a way that left no room for escape. But first, Min-ho needed to believe he was still winning. Min-ho believed he was still in control, and that belief was exactly what Jae-min needed him to hold on to a little longer. Publicly, Min-ho smiled wider than ever, appearing on magazine covers, announcing new projects, and speaking confidently about the company's unstoppable future. Privately, his days grew longer, his temper sharper, and his sleep shorter. As problems kept surfacing without a clear source, meetings ended in arguments, deadlines slipped. Executives began protecting themselves instead of the company. Min-ho felt the pressure tightening, yet every time he searched for the cause, he found nothing concrete, only the unsettling sense that someone was always one step ahead. Jae-min watched quietly, never interfering directly, allowing Min-ho's own habits to accelerate the damage. Chairman Kang reminded him that people revealed their worst instincts when they believed they were being cornered, and Min-ho was beginning to show exactly who he was. The first major crack appeared during a shareholder briefing. when Minho confidently announced projected profits that were impossible to meet. The numbers impressed the audience but terrified the finance team, who knew those figures were built on assumptions rather than reality. From the shadows, Jae-min made sure those assumptions collapsed at the worst possible moment. A key supplier pulled out. A regulatory review was triggered. An investor quietly withdrew support. None of these events could be traced back to him, yet together they formed a pattern that Minho could no longer ignore. He began suspecting sabotage, lashing out at executives and demanding loyalty, unaware that fear was pushing people further away. Seo Jian felt the change most clearly. The man she once believed was decisive now felt unstable, obsessed with appearances and terrified of losing what he had stolen. Their conversations turned tense, filled with half-spoken accusations and unspoken regret. One night, Seo Jian asked a question Minho wasn't prepared to answer. If Jae-min came back, she asked quietly, what would you do? Minho laughed it off, but his hands trembled, and Seo Jian noticed. That moment confirmed something she had tried to ignore for months, that Minho's confidence was built on fear, not strength. Meanwhile, Jae-min made his next move, this time not against the company, but against Minho's narrative. Anonymous reports began circulating among investors. Not accusations, but questions, subtle enough to plant doubt without triggering immediate defense. Why were certain contracts rushed? Why were audits delayed? Why were key executives resigning quietly? Minho responded by tightening control, demanding secrecy, and isolating himself further. A classic mistake that only amplified suspicion. Behind closed doors, legal teams worked overtime, not to protect the company, but to shield Minho personally, a distinction that did not go unnoticed. Chairman Kang warned Jae-min that Minho was becoming dangerous, not because he was losing, but because he was desperate to win at any cost. That warning proved true when Minho authorized a risky acquisition without proper approval, using funds that crossed legal boundaries. Jae-min saw it instantly. This was the mistake he had been waiting for. Instead of exposing it immediately, Jae-min documented everything, allowing Minho to commit deeper, ensuring there would be no escape once the truth surfaced. At the same time, Jae-min began reaching out to Seo Yun indirectly, not to reclaim her, but to understand how deeply she was entangled in Minho's decisions. What he learned unsettled him. Seo Zhen wasn't innocent, but she wasn't fully complicit either, trapped between ambition and fear, unable to step away without destroying her own future. Jae-min felt no anger toward her now, only a quiet sadness at how easily love had been replaced by convenience. As weeks passed, Minho's public image began to crack, headlines shifting from praise to cautious skepticism, and that shift alone cost him more sleep than any financial loss. One evening, alone in his office, Minho stared at the city lights and felt the same unease Jae-min once felt, sensing that something irreversible was approaching. He didn't know who his enemy was. He didn't know where the threat came from. But for the first time since stealing everything, Minho felt afraid. And fear, once awakened, had a way of guiding people straight into ruin. The collapse didn't begin with a scandal, because real destruction never announces itself that loudly. It began with questions. During a quarterly investor conference, one analyst asked Minho to clarify discrepancies between projected revenue and recent cash flow reports. A question delivered calmly but followed by uncomfortable silence. Minho answered confidently, yet his response lacked the certainty that once carried him through any room, and that hesitation was enough for doubt to spread. By the end of the week, regulatory agencies requested additional documentation, and auditors arrived earlier than expected, turning quiet offices into tense battlegrounds of whispered conversations. Minho ordered full cooperation, publicly welcoming transparency, while privately instructing his legal team to delay, redirect, and obscure anything that could be used against him. Jae-min watched it all unfold from a distance, noting every misstep, every rushed decision, and every attempt to protect one man instead of the company. Chairman Kang reminded him that the most powerful revelations were not accusations, but undeniable patterns, and Min-ho was creating them himself. The first resignation came unexpectedly, a senior executive stepping down for personal reasons, followed by another, and then another, each departure weakening Min-ho's grip and strengthening suspicion. Rumors spread internally, no longer whispers, but conversations held openly in hallways as employees began questioning leadership they no longer trusted. So Jian felt the pressure closing in faster than anyone. She noticed unfamiliar names in documents, sudden transfers of responsibility, and emergency meetings she was no longer invited to, signs that Min-ho was protecting himself by distancing those closest to him. One night, unable to endure the uncertainty, Seo-yeon searched old records on her own and found fragments of truth she had never wanted to see, connections between Min-ho and decisions that crossed ethical lines. The realization left her shaken because it meant that staying silent now made her complicit. Meanwhile, the press shifted tone, publishing cautious pieces that stopped short of accusations, but painted a picture of instability, forcing Min-ho into defensive interviews that only deepened public concern. During one such interview, a journalist asked a question that struck deeper than expected. Do you believe the company would be stronger if its original founder were still involved? Min-ho froze for half a second, a pause too small to notice unless someone was watching closely. Jae-min noticed. That night, Min-ho finally confirmed what he had feared for months, that someone was not only working against him, but understood him intimately. He ordered a private investigation, digging through old connections, financial trails, and personal histories, desperate to identify the invisible threat. The answer arrived sooner than he expected. A confidential report landed on his desk, detailing the movements of a shadow investor whose strategies mirrored Jae-min's own habits almost perfectly. The conclusion was unavoidable. Jae-min was alive. Min-ho felt a chill run through him, not because of revenge, but because he knew exactly how patient Jae-min could be when he set his mind on something. Panic crept in, and with it, reckless decisions. Min-ho authorized emergency fund transfers, bypassed oversight committees, and attempted to consolidate power in ways that only confirmed every suspicion surrounding him. Jae-min allowed it to happen, documenting everything, because desperation had turned Min-ho into his own worst enemy. Seo-yeon, finally unable to ignore the truth, reached out anonymously to a legal contact, seeking advice not on how to escape blame, but on how to make things right. That choice, small as it seemed, would soon change the outcome for everyone involved. As the investigation tightened, Min-ho received an official notice, a formal inquiry scheduled within the week, one that would require explanations he could no longer fabricate. He stared at the document in silence, realizing that the life he stole was now closing in around him. And somewhere in the city, Jae-min prepared for the moment when he would step out of the shadows, not as a victim, but as the man who had never truly lost control. The stage was set. The truth was coming. The day of the inquiry arrived without drama, which made it far more terrifying than any scandal headline ever could. Executives filled the conference hall early, lawyers sat with unreadable expressions, and journalists gathered outside, sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. Min-ho walked in wearing confidence like armor, his posture straight, his smile practiced, but those closest to him could see the cracks forming beneath the surface. He had prepared statements, rehearsed explanations, and contingency plans for every accusation except one, Jae-min. As the inquiry began, evidence was presented slowly and methodically, not as attacks, but as facts that spoke louder than emotion. Financial discrepancies, unauthorized transfers, contracts signed without oversight, Each revelation chipped away at Minho's authority, while the room grew quieter, heavier, as if everyone was holding their breath. Minho responded sharply at first, dismissing concerns as misunderstandings, blaming former executives and citing market volatility, that the confidence in his voice began to fade. Then the lead investigator paused and introduced a new witness, an anonymous investor whose actions had directly influenced recent events. The doors at the back of the room opened, and Jae-min walked in. The reaction was immediate and uncontrollable. Gasps rippled through the room, whispers spread like fire, and even the investigators struggled to maintain order as the man believed to be ruined stepped forward calmly. Jae-min looked different, not weaker, but sharper, composed, and undeniably present, carrying himself with a quiet authority Minho hadn't felt since the day he took everything. Minho froze, his expression collapsing as years of buried fear surged to the surface, because in that moment he understood that every unexplained problem had a face. Jae-min spoke clearly, without anger, explaining his disappearance, the betrayal, and the careful steps he took to protect the company from within the shadows. He presented evidence not to reclaim power, but to reveal the truth Minho had spent years burying. The room listened in silence because this was no longer a corporate dispute. It was a reckoning. When questioned, Seo-Yen stood up, her voice trembling but steady, admitting what she knew, what she ignored, and what she feared, choosing honesty over self-preservation for the first time. Her testimony shattered the last illusion Minho clung to, exposing not just financial crimes, but the personal manipulations that fueled them. Minho lashed out, accusing Jae-min of orchestrating everything, calling him vindictive, obsessed, and unwilling to let go, but his words rang hollow against the weight of evidence. The investigators announced their decision before the day ended. Minho was removed immediately from all executive authority pending criminal investigation. Security escorted him out, not with force, but with finality, mirroring the day Jae-min had been walked out of his own company. As Minho passed Jae-min, their eyes met briefly, and in that silent exchange, Minho understood the true cost of betrayal. Outside, reporters swarmed, shouting questions, cameras flashing, but Jae-min said nothing, allowing the truth to speak for itself. The company's future remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the lie was over. The city felt quieter after the truth came out, not because the world had slowed down, but because the noise of lies had finally stopped. In the days following the inquiry, the company entered a period of controlled chaos. Executives replaced, accounts frozen, and investigations expanding far beyond what anyone initially expected. Minho disappeared from the public eye almost overnight, his name removed from headlines and replaced with legal terminology that carried far heavier consequences than shame alone. For the first time since losing everything, Jae-min stood inside the company building again, not as a ghost, not as an enemy, but as the man who had built it from the ground up. Yet the feeling wasn't triumphant, it was heavy. The board offered Jae-min his position back without hesitation, framing it as a restoration of order, but Jae-min asked for time instead of power, surprising everyone in the room. He wanted to see what remained after ambition, betrayal, and fear had stripped everything bare. Employees watched him carefully, unsure whether to fear him or trust him, until Jae-min addressed them openly, not as a CEO, but as someone who had stood where they stood. He spoke about mistakes, not Minho's alone, but his own, admitting that blind trust and unchecked authority had created the conditions for betrayal to thrive. That honesty changed something. Not overnight, but enough to begin rebuilding trust on something real. Seo-Yeon requested a private meeting days later, and when she finally stood in front of Jae-min, the distance between them felt wider than ever, filled with things neither could undo. She apologized without excuses, acknowledging that she had chosen comfort over truth and silence over loyalty, choices that followed her longer than she ever expected. Jae-min listened quietly, not because he forgave easily, but because he no longer needed answers to move forward. He wished her well, not out of kindness, but because holding on to resentment would only tie him to a past he had already outgrown. Seo Jeon left in silence, carrying the weight of her decisions alone, just as Jae-min once had. Minho's trial began months later, unfolding publicly and painfully, revealing layers of deception that shocked even those who thought they knew the full story. Jae-min attended only once, watching from the back of the courtroom as the man he once called brother faced the consequences of his choices. There was no satisfaction in it, only a quiet understanding that betrayal never ended where it began. Chairman Kang visited Jae-min one last time before leaving the city, reminding him that survival was not the same as victory, and that true strength was choosing what to protect after the war ended. With that lesson in mind, Jae-min declined full executive control, instead restructuring leadership to prevent the concentration of power that had nearly destroyed everything. The company survived, not as it was before, but as something more cautious, more human, and far more aware of the cost of ambition. On a quiet evening, Jae-min stood alone on a rooftop, looking at the city lights once again, not with pride, but with clarity. He had lost love, he had lost time, he had lost himself, but he had gained something far more valuable: the ability to see people clearly, to recognize loyalty without mistaking it for obedience, and to build a future that no longer depended on blind trust. As the wind moved through the city, Jae-min turned away from the past, not because it no longer mattered, but because it no longer controlled him. The friend who stole his love, his company, and his life had made one final mistake. He believed Jae-min would never rise again, and that belief cost him everything.